Sebastian Hale hadn't felt a gentle touch in 20 years. His $5,000 bespoke suit was shredded and soaked in a mixture of rain and his own blood. His breathing was shallow, hampered by ribs that felt like broken glass under his skin. This was the man who, only 4 hours ago, had held the city's skyline in his palm. Now, he lay in the oil-stained shadows of a deserted train station, unable to even crawl toward a public phone. Earlier that night, the men he had fed, clothed, and protected, the soldiers he had treated like sons, had turned their barrels on him in a coordinated slaughter that smelled of a setup from the very heart of his organization. He had no phone, no allies, and not a single soul left who would answer his call. He was done. Then a steady, rhythmic click of heels echoed across the empty concrete. As a shadow fell over him, Sabastian flinched, his muscles coiled for a violence he could no longer defend against. In his world, a stranger in the dark was always a finishing blow, but when he forced his eyes open, he didn't see a hitman. He saw Julia Harper. She was dressed in faded teal medical scrubs, a stethoscope draped around her neck like a silver talisman against the dark. Her eyes were tired from a double shift at the hospice, but as she looked at the bleeding man at her feet, she didn't show a flicker of fear. She didn't see a Mafia kingpin. She saw a patient in shock. She knelt beside him, her movements practiced and calm, and reached into her bag for a clean roll of gauze. "Mister, stay still," she whispered, her voice a steady anchor in the freezing night. "You're bleeding through that jacket." Before he could snap a warning or push her away, she pressed her warm, steady hand against his trembling, scarred knuckles. Sebastian Hale, a man who had ordered deaths without a second thought and built a kingdom on iron-fisted fear, felt the simple, unearned heat of her hand, and something inside him finally fractured. He didn't cry quiet, dignified tears. He shuddered with the weight of a man who had realized that his millions couldn't buy the very thing this stranger was giving him for free. Julia sat there on that cold station floor, keeping a professional but respectful distance as she began to dress his wounds. She was a woman who lived paycheck to paycheck, a caregiver who spent her life nursing those the world had forgotten, yet here she was, offering sanctuary to a man who had lost everything. She looked him in the eye and asked 3 words. 6 letters that changed the trajectory of his life. "Do you need help?" That is where this story truly begins. If this opening is already pulling at your heart, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to see the power of a single act of kindness today. Cold steel of the midnight. Air was nothing compared to the eyes that settled in Sebastian Hale's chest when he realized his own shadow had turned against him. For a decade, the Hale organization had been a fortress built on blood and absolute loyalty, or so he believed. As he stepped out of his black sedan into the pouring rain of the industrial district, the silence wasn't the heavy, respectful kind he was used to. It was the hollow silence of an empty tomb. Behind him, the rhythmic click of safeties being disengaged sounded like a chorus of death. Sebastian didn't have to turn around to know that the 3 men standing at his back, men he had pulled from the gutters and given lives of luxury, were no longer his protectors. "Is this the price, then?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that masked the sudden spike of adrenaline. How much did the rival syndicate offer for a king's head? There was no answer, only the flash of muzzles and the deafening roar of gunfire. Sebastian moved by instinct, a blur of motion honed by years of surviving the very streets he now ruled. He dived behind a stack of steel crates as the world dissolved into chaos. He felt the white-hot sear of a bullet grazing his temple and another tearing through the shoulder of his $5,000 suit. Pain was an old acquaintance, but this was a visceral agony he hadn't expected. It was the pain of a foundation crumbling. He reached for his own weapon, his hand steady despite the carnage. He managed to return fire, seeing the shock on his attackers' faces as their prey fought back with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. But he was one man against a calculated execution. His men didn't just fall, they were shredded by their own greed. As a grenade detonated nearby, the force of the blast threw Sebastian against a brick wall, his ribs snapping with a sickening crunch. He struggled to his feet, his vision blurring as blood caked his brow. He couldn't go to his safe houses, They would be traps now. He couldn't call his lieutenants. Their silence was his answer. Dragging his shattered body through the winding, rain-slicked alleyways, he focused on a single goal: the deserted train station 3 blocks away. Every step was a battle against the darkness pulling at the edges of his mind. He was a king without a throne, a boss without an empire, stumbling toward a destination that offered no hope, only a place to stop running. By the time he collapsed into the shadows of the platform, the man who once controlled the city's underworld was nothing more than a ghost. Waiting for the end, the rhythmic click of Julia Harper's heels echoed through the cavernous, hollow shell of the train station, a lonely sound that matched the exhaustion deep in her marrow. Her double shift at the hospice had ended an hour ago, leaving her smelling of antiseptic and the faint, sweet scent of the lavender lotion she used to soothe her patients. The city was still, caught in that fragile, blue hour before dawn when only the desperate and the weary were awake. She was halfway across the platform, her mind already drifting toward her small apartment and a lukewarm cup of tea, when she saw the shadow that didn't belong at tea first. She thought it was a pile of discarded industrial rags huddled against a rusted pillar. But then came the sound, a wet, ragged hitch of a breath that made the hair on her arm stand up. Julia froze. Her pulse hammered against her throat, a frantic warning to keep walking. This was a neighborhood where curiosity usually ended in a police report, and she was a woman alone in the dark, but the caregiver in her was stronger than the survivalist. She took a tentative step closer, the beam of her phone's flashlight cutting through the gloom. It landed on a hand large, pale, and trembling. The knuckles split open. Then, the light traveled up a shredded navy blue jacket, wet with more than just rain. The metallic tang of blood hit her nose, sharp and unmistakable. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The man looked like he had been put through a meat grinder. His face was a mask of dark bruises and drying crimson. Yet even in his ruined state, there was an air of dangerous authority about him that made her hesitate. He flinched at the light, his eyes fluttering open to reveal a gaze so cold and full of predatory darkness that Julia's instinct screamed at her to run. "Mister," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" Sabastian didn't answer with words. His fingers clawed weakly at the concrete, a desperate, animalistic motion of someone who expected a blow rather than a hand. Julia looked toward the station exit, then back at the dying man. She knew the risks. Helping a man like this meant inviting his shadows into her light. It meant crossing a line she could never uncross. "God help me," she breathed, but she didn't turn away. She knelt, the cold dampness of the platform soaking into her teal scrubs. As she reached into her bag for her medical kit, she saw him coil, his muscles tensing for a fight he had already lost. "Stay still," she said, her voice dropping into the steady, professional cadence that had comforted 100 dying souls. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm a nurse. You're in shock. And if I don't stop this bleeding, you won't see the sunrise for a heartbeat." Their eyes locked, the hunter and the healer. Then, the tension broke in his shoulders, and Sabastian Hill let his head fall back against the pillar, surrendering his life to the hands of a stranger who owed him nothing. The silence of Julia's small apartment was thick, broken only by the steady hiss of a kettle and the heavy, labored breathing of the man slumped at her kitchen table. Sabastian Hale watched her through a haze of pain, his eyes tracking every movement as she moved with a quiet, efficient grace. She had managed to get him into her car and up 3 flights of stairs without a single neighbor glancing their way. Now, under the harsh hum of a flickering fluorescent light, she was cutting away the ruined fabric of his shirt to reveal the carnage beneath. "Why?" The word was a raspy, grating sound, barely more than a whisper. Julia didn't look up as she soaked a cloth in warm, soapy water. "Why what, mister? Nobody does this," Sabastian grunted, his sizing flinch as the cloth touched a jagged tear in his side. "Not for free. You saw the blood. You saw the suit. You know I'm not a man you want to be associated with. I see a man with 3 broken ribs and a deep laceration that's going to need 12 stitches if you don't want to bleed out on my linoleum." Julia countered. Her voice was calm, but there was a weariness in it that spoke of 1,000 long nights. She reached for a bottle of antiseptic. This is going to sting. As the liquid bit into his flesh, Sabastian didn't cry out. He only gripped the edge of the wooden table until his knuckles turned white. His mind, usually a sharp instrument of strategy and survival, was racing. In his world, kindness was a transaction, a down payment on a future favor, or a trap designed to lower a man's guard. He looked around the modest kitchen, the mismatched mugs, the pile of bills on the counter, the single, wilting potted plant on the sill. "How much?" he asked, his voice hardening. "Whatever the rival syndicate is paying for my location, I'll triple it. Just give me a phone. Don't play the saint. Just tell me your price." Julia stopped. She finally looked him in the eye, her brown gaze steady and filled with a sudden, sharp clarity. "My price is that you stay quiet so I don't wake my neighbors, and you let me finish cleaning this wound before it gets infected. I don't care about your syndicates, and I don't want your money, Sabastian." He froze at the mention of his name. He hadn't told her who he was. "I saw the ID in your wallet when I was looking for medical history," she said, answering his unspoken question. She went back to her work, her hands never shaking as she began the first stitch. "I know exactly who you are, and I'm still here. Now, hold still." For the first time in his life, the boss of the city felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the rain. He looked at the woman who had nothing, offering sanctuary to a man who had lost everything, and for the first time, he couldn't find the angle. There was no price. There was only the sting of the needle and the impossible weight of a mercy he didn't know how to carry. The days that followed were a blur of feverish shadows and the muffled roar of the city screaming for Sebastian's head. Outside the thin walls of Julia's third-floor walk-up, the world was being turned inside out. Sirens became the constant soundtrack of the neighborhood, and the morning news was a relentless scroll of burning warehouses and the grim faces of detectives standing over bodies in the rain. The Hale organization was being dismantled in broad daylight, and the rival syndicate was tearing through the city like a predatory beast that had finally tasted blood inside the apartment. The air smelled of antiseptic and the vanilla candle Julia lit to mask the metallic scent of healing wounds. Sabastian spent most of his time on the narrow sofa, his world reduced to the span of a few worn cushions and the flickering light of the television. He watched his empire fall in real time, seeing the names of men he'd trusted listed as missing or dead every time a car door slammed on the street below. His hand instinctively reached for a phantom weapon, his eyes snapping to the door with the cold, lethal precision of a man who lived on a hair trigger. Julia moved around him with a calm that bordered on the surreal. She didn't ask about the fires on the news or the sirens that seemed to circle the block like vultures. She simply went to work, returning with heavy bags of groceries and fresh bandages, her presence a steadying anchor in the middle of a hurricane. She forced him to eat soup he couldn't taste and drink water he didn't want, treating the most feared man in the city with the same firm, no-nonsense kindness she gave to the dying patients at the hospice. "The news says they're looking for you," she said one evening, her voice low as she adjusted the pillows behind his aching back. "They say you're a ghost." "I am a ghost," Sebastian rasped, his eyes fixed on the screen where his old penthouse was being cordoned off with yellow tape. "And anyone who helps a ghost usually ends up joining them. You should have left me at the station, Julia." Julia didn't flinch. She just sat on the edge of the coffee table, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the kitchen. "I've spent 10 years helping people who were already gone. You're still breathing, Sabastian. That makes you my responsibility." He looked at her then, really looked at her, through the veil of his own darkness. She was risking everything, her job, her safety, her life to hide a man the world wanted buried. There were no cameras here, no subordinates to impress, and no money to be gained. For the first time, the boss felt the walls of his suspicion beginning to crack. Under the radar of a city that was burning for him, he was being kept alive by a woman who refused to believe he was a monster. Under the quiet hum of her refrigerator and the soft light of her lamp, Sabastian Hale was learning that the most effective way to stay hidden wasn't through fear, but through the invisibility of a stranger's mercy, through the narrow slats of the window blinds. Sabastian watched the sun climb over the jagged skyline of a city that no longer belonged to him. But his attention wasn't on the streets. It was on the quiet, exhausted woman moving through the small kitchen. Julia was preparing for another shift, her movements slow and heavy with a fatigue that seemed woven into her very skin. He saw her count out $3 bills and a handful of change, staring at the meager pile with a furrowed brow before tucking it into her pocket. She had just spent the last of her savings on the medical-grade antibiotics keeping his fever at bay. Yet she hadn't uttered a single complaint. In the underworld, Sabastian had been surrounded by people who would kill for a fraction of what Julia gave away for free. He was used to the respect of bowed heads and trembling hands, a respect born entirely of terror. But as he sat in the shadows, he began to see a different kind of power. That afternoon, a neighbor knocked on the door, an elderly woman with a frayed shawl and eyes clouded by cataracts. She didn't come with a tribute or a plea for protection. She came with a small Tupperware container of warm cornbread. "For you, Julia," the woman whispered, her voice thick with genuine affection. "For all you do for us." Sabastian watched from the bedroom doorway, his hand instinctively tightening on the doorframe. He saw the way Julia's face transformed, the weariness lifting for a fleeting second to reveal a smile of pure, uncomplicated gratitude. There was no fear in that room, no hidden agendas. The elderly woman didn't bow, yet the air was heavy with a reverence Sabastian had never achieved with all his millions and his muscle. Later that evening, before she left, he found her sitting at the small kitchen table, head in her hands, the weight of the world seemingly crushing her shoulders. He stepped into the light, his gait still hitched but his eyes clear. "You're running yourself into the ground for people who have nothing," he rasped. "Why? You could walk away. You have the skills to work in the high-end clinics, the ones with the marble floors and the patients who pay in gold." Julia looked up, her brown eyes tired but fierce. "The people with marble floors have plenty of doctors, Sabastian. My people only have me, and I don't need gold to know my value." She stood up, straightened her scrubs, and walked out the door, leaving him alone in the quiet apartment. Sabastian looked at the small container of cornbread on the counter. He realized then that he had lived his entire life in a palace of glass, thinking he was a king, while Julia lived in a fortress of heart, earning more loyalty with a single bandage than he ever had with 1,000 guns. They were worlds apart, and for the first time, he was the one who felt poor. The shadows in Julia's apartment felt longer that afternoon, stretching across the floor like the reach of the ghost Sabastian had tried to outrun. His body was healing, but his mind remained a restless predator trapped in a cage of quiet domesticity. While Julia was at work, he finally reached for the burner phone he had forced her to buy him with her last $50. His fingers, once capable of orchestrating the movement of millions with a single text, felt heavy and clumsy as he dialed a number that was never supposed to be out of service. The line didn't even ring. It was a dead, hollow tone that vibrated against his ear like a funeral bell. He dialed another, then a third. These were the men who had sworn oaths in blood, men who had sat at his table and called him father. He reached for the ghost, his most elusive lieutenant, and finally, the line connected. But there was no greeting. "The king is dead, Sabastian," a voice whispered, cold and devoid of the reverence it had held for a decade. "The funeral was 3 days ago. There's a new name on the door, and a bounty on your shadow that could buy a small country. If you're still breathing, do us all a favor and stop. You're not a boss anymore. You're a liability." The line went dead. Sabastian sat on the edge of the sofa, the phone slipping from his grip to the carpet. He looked at his hands, the hands that had built a criminal empire from nothing, and saw they were shaking. He wasn't just hiding. He had been erased. His accounts were drained. His safe houses were seized. And the men he had raised like sons had buried him in a shallow grave of silence to save their own skins. He stood up, the pain in his ribs a sharp reminder of his mortality, and walked to the small bathroom mirror. He saw a man with yellowing bruises and a ragged beard, wearing a cheap t-shirt Julia had found at a thrift store. The broken king stared back at him, and for the first time, the reflection didn't look like a ruler. It looked like a man who had traded his soul for a throne made of salt, only for it to dissolve in the first storm. He realized then that the loyalty he had prized was nothing but a reflection of the fear he had sowed. Fear doesn't survive a funeral. As the evening sun dipped below the skyline, casting the city he once owned into darkness, Sebastian Hale realized he was truly alone. The only person in the world who acknowledged his existence was a woman who didn't even know what he had done to earn that throne, and she was currently scrubbing floors in a hospice just to keep him fed. The weight of his own obsolescence was heavier than any bullet he had ever taken. He wasn't just a ghost. He was a memory that his own world was working tirelessly to forget. The rain returned that evening, a relentless drumming against the glass that seemed to pull the walls of the apartment closer. Sebastian sat in the dim light of the kitchen, watching Julia as she moved with a mechanical stiffness that spoke of a fatigue far deeper than a long shift. She didn't go to the cupboard for food. Instead, she sat at the small table and stared at a framed photograph she usually kept tucked behind a vase of dried flowers. "You're carrying a weight that doesn't belong to you," Sebastian said, his voice a low gravel in the quiet room. "I've seen men break under less. Why do you do it, Julia? Why spend your life tending to the dying when you could have walked away from me and everyone else long ago?" Julia didn't look up, but her fingers traced the edge of the frame. "I didn't always have medical scrubs and a kit, Sebastian. 10 years ago, I had a brother, Marcus. He was brilliant, a musician who could make a cello weep. But in this neighborhood, brilliance doesn't protect you from a stray bullet meant for someone else." She finally turned the photo toward him. It showed a young man with a wide, bright smile, his arm draped over a younger Julia's shoulder. "The ambulance was slow," she continued, her voice devoid of its usual professional armor. "The hospitals were full. I sat on a sidewalk exactly like the one where I found you, holding his hand, watching his life leak out onto the concrete. I didn't know how to stop the bleeding. I didn't know how to save him. I just sat there and promised him it would be okay while I watched him disappear." Sebastian felt a coldness in his gut that had nothing to do with his injuries. He knew that sidewalk. He knew the someone else the bullet had likely been meant for. "I went to school so I would never have to be that helpless girl again," Julia whispered. "I help people because I know what it feels like to wait for a miracle that never comes. Every time I stop a wound from bleeding, every time I sit with someone who is scared of the dark, I'm finishing that conversation with Marcus. I'm making sure that, for one more night, the world doesn't win." She stood up, her face a mask of weary resolve, and began to prep a fresh bandage for Sebastian's side. As she worked, her touch was as gentle as it was firm, a stark contrast to the violence that had defined Sebastian's existence. He looked at her not as a tool for his survival, but as a woman who had built a cathedral of hope out of the ruins of her own heart. He realized then that Julia wasn't saving him because he was important or powerful. She was saving him because she knew the exact value of a life that everyone else had decided was worth nothing. The caregiver's burden wasn't a choice. It was a debt she paid to the memory of a boy who had died in the dark, and for the first time, Sebastian felt a crushing shame for the world he had helped build. The following morning, the apartment felt different. The air was no longer thick with the stale scent of a dying empire, but with the quiet, focused energy of a man who had found a new target for his gaze. Sebastian watched from the shadows of the hallway as Julia sat at her kitchen table, staring at a stack of documents with a look of defeated exhaustion that no amount of coffee could fix. She was trying to help her neighbors fight a predatory developer who had quietly bought the titles to their block, intending to pave over their homes for a luxury high-rise. "You're playing a game you don't understand, Julia," Sebastian said, his voice a low vibration in the small room as he stepped into the light. He wasn't the broken ghost of the train station anymore. He stood taller, the predatory sharpness returning to his eyes, but this time it wasn't aimed at her. Julia sighed, rubbing her temples. "They're good people, Sebastian. The developer is using legal loopholes to push them out by the end of the month. I've called the city, the lawyers, everyone. Nobody cares about a few old brick buildings." Sebastian pulled a chair out and sat opposite her, his hands the hands that had once moved millions across offshore accounts reaching for the papers. He didn't see a community problem. He saw a flaw in a hostile takeover. "In my world, we don't call the city. We look for the person holding the leash." For the next 3 hours, Sebastian worked. He didn't use a gun or a threat. He used the cold, ruthless logic that had built a criminal empire. He identified the shell companies, tracked the developers' hidden debts, and found the one local official who was being paid to look the other way. He mapped out a strategy of leverage, showing Julia exactly where to apply pressure to make the project too expensive and too risky to continue. "Don't ask them for mercy," he whispered, pointing to a specific name on a property deed. "Ask them why they're using a Cayman-based subsidiary to avoid state taxes. Tell them you have the transaction codes. They won't just stop the eviction. They'll run from this neighborhood like it's on fire." Julia watched him, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and a strange, flickering realization. For the first time, she saw the boss, the brilliant, calculating mind that could dismantle a fortress with a single well-placed thought. But he wasn't doing it for power or for a cut of the profits. He was doing it because she had asked for help. When they finished, a heavy silence settled between them. Sebastian looked at his hands and realized he had just used his greatest weapon to save a playground instead of a drug route. The first seed of change had been planted in the cracks of his hardened heart. He wasn't just a man worth saving. He was becoming a man capable of saving others. For the first time in 36 years, Sabastian Hale didn't feel like a monster. He felt like a neighbor. The peace of the apartment shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when the heavy, rhythmic pounding of a fist against the door sent Sebastian into a silent, lethal crouch in the shadows of the hallway. Julia had just walked in from her shift, her jacket still damp with the evening mist. She froze, her eyes meeting Sebastian's in the dim light. Through the thin wood of the door, a voice vibrated with the cold authority of the state and the underlying threat of something much darker. "Detective Vance, Julia, we know you're in there. Open up. We just have a few questions about a certain passenger at the station last week." Sebastian's hand gripped the edge of the doorframe, his knuckles turning white. His mind, now sharp and calculating again, saw the board clearly. The syndicate had bribed the precinct. The law was no longer a shield, but a tracking dog. He watched through the crack in the door as Julia straightened her scrubs, wiped the fatigue from her face, and opened the door. For the next 20 minutes, Sebastian listened to the dance. The detective wasn't just asking about the station. He was looking for a slip, a second set of keys on the counter, the smell of antiseptic that was too fresh for a single woman. He leaned into her space, his voice dropping to a predatory whisper, asking why a humble caregiver would be buying medical-grade antibiotics in cash at a pharmacy 3 miles from her home. Julia didn't waver. She used the truth as a weapon, explaining that her patients often lacked the funds for basic care. And she did what she had to do. When the door finally clicked shut, the silence that followed was heavier than the interrogation. Julia leaned her back against the wood, her breath coming in ragged hitches. She looked at Sebastian, and for the first time, he saw the flicker of true, unadulterated terror in her eyes. Not for herself, but for what would happen to him if they returned. "They know, Julia," Sebastian rasped, stepping into the kitchen. The yellow light cast long, jagged shadows across his face. "They don't have proof yet, but they smell the blood. They'll be back. And next time, it won't be a detective at the door. It'll be a cleaning crew with silenced barrels." He walked to the small closet and pulled out the worn jacket she had found for him. He began to check the stitches he had reinforced himself. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice flat and devoid of the warmth they had shared over the kitchen table. "If I stay, I am the bullet that kills you. I've spent my whole life being a curse to the people around me. I won't let you be the next name on that list." He looked at her then, seeing the woman who had nursed a monster back to life, and for the first time, he felt the crushing weight of a loyalty he couldn't buy. He was a ghost again, preparing to walk back into the darkness to ensure her light stayed burning. The apartment felt smaller that night, the walls pressing in as if the city itself were holding its breath. Sebastian stood by the small window, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the flickering neon of the street below. He had his meager belongings packed into a plastic bag the same way he had arrived, yet everything was different. He reached for the doorknob, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the floor. But he felt a hand close around his wrist. Julia's touch was light, but it carried a weight that stopped him in his tracks. "Don't just disappear into the dark, Sebastian," she whispered. "Not like this." He turned, And for the first time, he didn't look like a boss or a ghost. He looked like a man who was drowning in the air. I've spent my life standing on thresholds, Julia. Usually, it's to decide who lives and who dies. But this, he gestured to the humble kitchen, the mismatched chairs, the scent of lavender and antiseptic. This is the only place I've ever been where I didn't have to be a monster. And that makes leaving it the hardest thing I've ever done. Julia stepped closer, crossing the invisible line they had maintained for weeks. She looked at the scars on his face, the ones she had cleaned, and the deeper ones she had only begun to understand. "You think you're protecting me by going back out there," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "But you're the first person in 10 years who looked at my burden and offered to help carry it. Marcus died because the world looked the other way. I'm not looking away from you." Sebastian felt the armor he had worn for 36 years dissolve. He reached out, his large, scarred hand hesitating before finally cupping her cheek. His thumb brushed against her skin with a tenderness that felt like a foreign language. He realized then that he wasn't just afraid of the syndicate. He was afraid of the man he was becoming, a man who finally had something to lose. They stood there in the quiet pocket of the storm, two strangers from different worlds sharing a breath in the dim light. No words were needed to acknowledge the unspoken promise hanging between them. For a few heartbeats, the sirens were distant. The betrayal was a memory, and the boss was simply a man who had found his sanctuary. But even as he leaned his forehead against hers, the low, predatory rumble of a heavy engine idling at the curb echoed from the street below. The threshold had been crossed, and the world was coming to collect its debt. The low hum of the idling engine was followed by the heavy, synchronized thud of car doors closing. In the silence of the hallway, the sound was as final as the cocking of a hammer. Sebastian moved Julia away from the door with a firm but gentle hand, his eyes scanning the room for anything that could be used as a weapon. But he realized with a jolt of clarity that there were no guns here. No steel-reinforced doors, only the fragile sanctuary of a woman who had never seen the kind of hell that was about to walk through her entrance. When the first kick hit the door, the wood groaned but held. "Julia, get in the bathroom. Lock the door," Sebastian commanded, his voice returning to the lethal, resonant tone of the man he used to be. But Julia didn't move toward the back of the apartment. Instead, she stepped forward, her face pale but her eyes burning with a fierce, quiet light. She wiped her hands on her scrubs and stood directly in front of the door, her small frame a defiant shield. "No," she whispered. "This is my home. They don't get to just walk in." Before Sebastian could pull her back, the door splintered and swung open. Two men in sharp, dark suits stepped into the threshold, their suppressed pistols already raised. They stopped short at the sight of the woman in teal scrubs. "Step aside, nurse," the taller one rasped, his eyes fixed on Sebastian in the shadows. "This is business. Don't make it personal." "It's already personal," Julia said, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. "He is my patient, and you are trespassing." Sebastian watched her from the dark, his heart hammering against his healing ribs. For 20 years, he had protected his territory with blood, assuming that was the only way to hold a line. But seeing Julia stand her ground with nothing but her moral conviction forced a shift in his very soul. He didn't want to be the monster that let her die. He wanted to be the man who deserved her protection. He didn't rush them with a roar. He moved like a shadow, catching the first man's wrist and twisting it upward just as a muffled shot went into the ceiling. He used the momentum to drive the man into his partner, but he didn't go for the kill. He used his strategic mind to disarm and disable, his movements precise and controlled. He fought not to conquer, but to preserve the peace of the room. As he stood over the groaning enforcers, holding their discarded weapons, he looked at Julia. She was still standing, her chest heaving, her eyes locked on his. He realized then that the boss had finally died on that doorstep, replaced by someone who fought for the light because a caregiver had shown him it was worth the struggle. The aftermath of the doorstep struggle hung in the air like the ozone before a lightning strike. Sebastian looked at the two disarmed enforcers groaning on the floor, then back at Julia, whose chest was heaving, her hands still balled into defiant fists. He knew this was only the first wave. The syndicate didn't send two men to kill a ghost. They sent them to confirm the ghost had a haunt. Now that they knew, this apartment, this sanctuary of lavender and mismatched chairs, was no longer a home. It was a kill zone. They won't stop until the foundation is ash, Julia, Sabastian said, his voice dropping into that low, resonant frequency of a man who had already accepted his fate. He didn't look like a patient anymore. He stood with a terrifying, upright stillness, the predatory weight of the boss returning to his shoulders. I have to end this. Not here. Not near you. Sabastian, wait, Julia started, reaching for him, but he stepped out of her reach, already moving toward the door. He didn't just walk out. He made sure he was seen. He pulled out the burner phone and dialed a number he knew was being monitored by the syndicate's deep packet trackers. He didn't speak a word. He simply let the line stay open for 10 seconds, long enough for their triangulation software to lock onto the signal, moving away from the residential block and toward the derelict warehouses by the river. He stepped onto the sidewalk, the flickering streetlights catching the sharp planes of his face. For the first time since the ambush, Sabastian Hale didn't hide in the shadows. He walked directly into the center of the street, tall and unmistakable, a beacon for every predatory eye in the city. He could feel the eyes of the neighborhood watching from behind cracked blinds, and more importantly, he felt the shift in the city's predatory pulse. The great reveal was a siren song to his enemies. Within minutes, the heavy purr of engines began to converge on his location. The black SUVs turning onto the main road like sharks sensing blood. He looked back one last time at the third-floor window where a single light was burning. He was leading the storm away from the only person who had ever seen the man beneath the monster. As the first pair of headlights illuminated his path, Sabastian felt a strange, cold peace. He wasn't running to save his empire or his throne. He was running to be the shield Julia Harper deserved. He was no longer a king, but he had finally found something worth dying for. He turned the corner, the roar of the approaching syndicate echoing through the canyon of buildings, leading the darkness back into the dark. The warehouse district was a graveyard of rusted iron and broken glass, the perfect stage for a king to burn his own kingdom to the ground. Sabastian stood in the center of the derelict shipyard, the cold rain washing the last traces of Julia's lavender scent from his skin. He didn't hide. He didn't wait. He had leaked his location with the precision of a master strategist. And now the predators had arrived. A fleet of black SUVs fanned out, their headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of deep-sea monsters. Warren Pace stepped out of the lead vehicle, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel. He looked at Sabastian, scarred, bearded, wearing a thrift store jacket, and laughed, a hollow sound that echoed against the corrugated metal walls. You should have stayed a ghost, Sabastian. You look like a beggar. I am a beggar, Sabastian rasped, his voice steady even as the red dots of multiple snipers settled on his chest. I'm here to beg you to look at the screen. He held up the burner phone Julia had bought him. On every device in Warren's perimeter, a notification chirped. Sabastian hadn't just been hiding. He had been using the strategic mind that built the organization to dismantle its foundation. He had sent the encrypted ledgers, the offshore routing codes, and the video evidence of the syndicate's ties to the city's highest offices, to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and every major news outlet in the state. I'm not the only one who's erased tonight, Warren, Sabastian said, his eyes as cold as the river. The Hale organization is dead. By tomorrow morning, every man in this circle will be a fugitive or a witness. The throne is ash. The air turned electric. Warren's face went from triumph to a sickly, pale terror as his own phone began to scream with alerts. Sabastian moved with the lethal efficiency he had honed over a lifetime. He didn't fight for power. He fought to ensure there was nothing left for them to fight over. In the chaos that followed the screech of tires as men tried to flee the encroaching sirens, the desperate, muffled exchanges of gunfire, Sabastian moved like a shadow through the flame. He settled his debts lethally with those who could never be allowed to walk free, and legally with those who would spend the rest of their lives in a concrete box. By the time the blue and red lights of the authorities flooded the shipyard, the boss was gone. He had burned the throne to protect the threshold of a third-floor walk-up. He walked away from the heat of the fire, his hands empty of blood for the first time in 36 years. He wasn't a king anymore. He was just a man, finally free of the dark, heading toward the only light that mattered. The sky over the city was no longer the bruised purple of a fading empire, but a clear, pale gold that heralded a quiet Sunday morning. Julia sat on the wooden bench of the small community park she had fought to save, the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine a gentle contrast to the antiseptic air she usually lived in. She watched the neighborhood children play on the newly painted equipment, their laughter a sound she once thought would be silenced by concrete and greed. She was so absorbed in the peace of the moment that she didn't hear the footsteps until they stopped beside her. Sabastian Hale didn't look like a ghost anymore. He was dressed in a simple charcoal sweater and dark jeans, the sharp, predatory edge of his silhouette softened by a calm she hadn't seen even in his deepest recovery. The bruises had faded to faint shadows, and the coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, contemplative stillness. He didn't sit down immediately. He stood for a moment, looking at the park he had helped her preserve. The developer officially withdrew the high-rise petition yesterday, Julia said, her voice a soft anchor in the morning air. The block is safe. You did that. We did that, Sabastian corrected, finally sitting on the edge of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger, not one filled with offshore codes, but with names of clinics, community centers, and hospice foundations. I spent my life building walls that kept people out. Now, I'm using what's left of the key holdings to make sure the doors stay open for those who need them most. He looked at her then, his gaze steady and filled with an emotion he had once been afraid to name. I went back to that shipyard to burn a throne, Julia. I thought I was doing it to save you. But standing there in the rain, I realized I was doing it because you made me believe I was worth saving too. Julia felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. She looked at the men beside her, not the Iron King or the wounded stranger from the train station, but a man who had finally found his way home. She reached out, her hand resting over his large, scarred knuckles just as it had on that first night. I told you once that I don't need gold to know my value, she whispered. And you don't need a throne to be a leader, Sabastian. You just needed to realize that your hands were made for more than just holding on to power. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the light dance through the trees. The story that had begun with a drop of blood on a deserted platform had ended with a promise in the light. Sabastian Hale was no longer a ghost, and Julia Harper was no longer carrying her burden alone. In the heart of the city they had both helped heal. They had found the only thing truly worth building. A future. The story emphasizes that a person's worth is not determined by their past mistakes or their social standing, but by their capacity to change and the positive impact they choose to make on others. Sabastian only becomes worth saving once he realizes he has a duty to save others.